Okay, moving on to the female reproductive system. Lots easier, obviously. Everybody just draws it as a triangle with a couple of tubes off it. So this is a fairly typical diagram. So the most obvious bit is this triangle representing the uterus. There's a sort of a gap in the middle. It's not a very big gap, but it's a gap nevertheless. Lined by the endometrium, endo meaning inside. Big thick muscular wall, the myometrium, and then of course it's got some connective tissue around the outside. The bottom of the uterus is the cervix. This is a very narrow opening and is usually most times of the month blocked with mucus to prevent anything accessing from the outside to the uterine cavity and causing infections. At ovulation, that mucus sort of thins and gets a bit runnier so that the sperm can get through. At the obviously the lead out from the uterus to the outside world is the vagina, this muscular tube. And then at the top we've got again connected to the uterine cavity, the fallopian tubes. Now these are the ones that when we looked at tissues last year, we looked at ciliated epithelium from the oviducts, and they are lined with ciliated epithelia, which are going to be the things that waft the egg down towards the uterus. And fallopian tube at the ovary end is expanded into sort of finger-like fimbriae, and these effectively act like catcher's mitts, so they move over the surface of the ovary, ready to catch an egg at ovulation. And then we have, of course, on either side an ovary. They're said to be about the size of walnuts, and that's where the main business of oogenesis goes on. So before we get to the sort of more complex diagram down here, let's just have a quick run through oogenesis, because although the sequence of events is the same as it is for males, and we have the same suffixes like gonia, site, the whole thing is a little bit different in terms of having different timings, and we've got these things called polar bodies to deal with as well. So starting off prior to birth, so just to talk about timings for a bit. Prior to birth, the ovary is composed of, amongst other things, germinal epithelial cells, which are going to do exactly what the germinal epithelial cells did in the male, and they're going to divide by mitosis lots and lots of times to give lots and lots of oogonia. And those are going to grow, but they are also going to start meiosis. And they stop at prophase. So remember, at prophase, our chromosomes, chromatins condensed to form visible chromosomes. We're in meiosis, so those chromosomes, those homologous pairs, have paired up and formed bivalents, and they're sort of, doing crossing over and stuff. And it stops there. Now what's formed then is the primary oocyte, but because everything's still in one cell, it's still going to be diploid. So our oogonia are diploid, germinal epithelia are diploid, primary oocytes are diploid. And then we get birth. So when baby girls are born, they've got their kind of, full complement of eggs, and we'll have a look at what those might appear like in an ovary. Everything sort of just stops. Nothing much happens until we get to puberty, and at puberty, out of those eggs, one will start to develop on a monthly basis. And by develop, I mean undergo the rest of meiosis. Now at the end of meiosis 1, remember in the males, we managed to get 2 cells. of pretty even size. So we've split the cytoplasm evenly between the two cells. In females it's different, and the cytoplasm doesn't get split evenly. Most of the cytoplasm, the vast majority, goes into one cell, the secondary oocyte, which is now haploid, and the other set of chromosomes and a teeny tiny bit of cytoplasm go off and form this first polar body. So effectively it's a way of ditching half the chromosomes but keeping all the cytoplasm to yourself. The secondary oocyte then starts meiosis 2 and stops at metaphase 2, which means that those individual chromosomes in the haploid cell are all lined up in the middle on the spindle attached by their centromeres. And it kind of stops there. So this is the thing that is ovulated, this secondary oocyte, and we'll do how it's sort of, what else is there as well. If nothing happens, if there's no fertilisation, it kind of stops in metaphase 2 and gets shed out with menstrual blood. If there's a fertilisation and a male nucleus enters this egg cell, then it enters the secondary oocyte. It will then carry on and do anaphase 2, telophase, do cytokinesis, and again uneven distribution of cytoplasm to give this sort of set of chromosomes in the second polar body with a teeny tiny bit of cytoplasm, and the egg cell gets the whole lot. And then we get those sort of pronuclei forming, the two pronuclei that are going to fuse together at fertilisation. So this only happens at fertilisation. So let's look at the sort of structure of our primary and secondary oocytes. So if we look at a sort of a cross section of an ovary, this isn't what you're going to see. They're always drawn diagrammatically to show the various stages of development, but of course if one primary follicle is going to develop, it's going to develop where it is and make a second, a mature follicle and then rupture. And there'll be other follicles over here, but they're always drawn in this kind of sequence to show how the development happens. So, our primary oocyte, stuck in prophase 1, is all of those oocytes in the ovary are surrounded by a little group of sort of follicular cells, often called granulosa or theca cells. Just stay there as primary follicles, sometimes called primordial follicles. Again, varies from account to account. Don't think they'll be too bothered which you use. I quite like primary, it's easier to spell. They stay there till puberty. At puberty, under the influence of FSH, those primary follicles, one of them will get bigger and bigger and bigger. Now in the middle of the primary follicle, we've got that primary oocyte. So now that is going to, over the first part of the menstrual cycle, until about day 14, if you've got a 28-day cycle, it's going to be doing the rest of that meiotic division and giving out its first polar body. What happens to the cells around though is they proliferate. That means you make loads of them, and therefore that follicle is going to get bigger and bigger and bigger, more and more and more cells, and those cells are churning out the female hormone estrogen. So we've got FSH from the pituitary gland, starts this process happening, and these cells are then churning out estrogen. And we'll see in a later video what those are doing. When they get to sort of full size, they develop this sort of fluid-filled space in the middle with the secondary oocyte off to one side, and that is called a Graafian follicle. Super word. And it's the Graafian follicle that's going to burst open, so the pressure, the fluid pressure in here is going to rupture the follicle. The ovum is going to sort of be almost spat out, squeezed out of that with the fluid. And at this stage, it's this secondary oocyte with its chromosomes lined up down the middle. It's got its little polar body, first polar body there. It's got round the outside of it a layer called the zona pellucida. This is a jelly-like coat. And then it's got a little sort of cloud of cells called the corona radiata. So those are just theca cells, so if you imagine sort of it takes those cells with it and leaves the rest behind. So the ruptured follicle releases our secondary oocyte, now haploid, and leaves behind the cells, and the cells then develop into this body, yellow body called the corpus luteum. And the corpus luteum is going to churn out two hormones. It's going to churn out in the second half of the cycle progesterone, and it's going to churn out estrogen. And both of those just to help to maintain this myometrium in a nice thickened state, all ready for its fertilised egg cell to come down and implant. So estrogen in the first part of the cycle builds up the myometrium. Progesterone and estrogen in the second half maintain that lining. Obviously, if nothing happens to the secondary oocyte, then this corpus luteum degenerates quite quickly into a corpus albicans, so that takes about 14 days effectively from ovulation to the disappearance of the corpus luteum. Once it disappears, it no longer makes those two hormones, and that means that this lining is no longer maintained, and so that's shed out through the cervix and vagina, and then the whole thing starts kicking off again. In fact, sort of simultaneously with this shedding, the FSH starts another follicle. Oh, failed that time, let's get another one going. So I hope that makes a bit more sense, and see you next time.